and those who aren't adherents of any monotheistic religion, in particular Christianity, Islam, or Judaism, but affirm either greater classical theism or Anselmian theism, or even just classical theism, and they're usually just known as philosophical theists because they derive their theism by philosophy alone, rather than relying on some specific sacred text of some type. I'm told that this version is generally pretty rare, philosophical theism, but there are a sizable number of philosophical theists out there. The second position is deism, which is held to a lesser extent, and it's also a monotheistic viewpoint, and it says that classical theism is true for the most part, and it sometimes even embraces aspects, well, actually, most of the time it embraces aspects of greater classical theism and rarely Anselmian theism, but it usually it usually has varying degrees of denial of the idea that God's concerned with human affairs. I mean, for instance, most commonly deists deny revealed theology, that God interacted with humans, and to give, like, for instance, say, to inspire humans to write the Bible, or that he gave the Quran to Muhammad, or things like that. The deists would deny that. Most deists. They might reject aspects of that, or even all of that. Some deists could consistently proclaim that God's concerned with human affairs to some extent, such that God will judge humans, wants humans to be good, so on and so forth. In fact, that was a type of deism popular to deists back in the Enlightenment period. At least to some of them. For instance, Thomas Paine and various other founding fathers. Of course, not all of the founding fathers were deists, not very many were, but of those that were deists, they remarkably shared the belief that, for instance, God would judge humans, that there's an afterlife, and things like that. And most deists tend to place an emphasis on natural theology as deriving the justification of their belief, and that's a field of study that we're going to discuss pretty soon. The third type of monotheism I want to discuss is called pantheism, and it either says God's identical with everything, and this is called existence or being, or so on and so forth, or identical with nature. The former view, I guess you could call it classical pantheism, and the secondary view is naturalistic pantheism. And the former may or may not accept classical theism, and many variants of classical pantheism do affirm classical theism, as in, for instance, they say that God's personal. But there are also a number of views, for instance, Parmenides, or arguably the view of the absolute idealists, that deny the personality of God, which kind of brings us to the question of calling that entity God, rather than say, I don't know, the ground of all being, or something of that nature. It tends towards more of a monistic rather than theistic view right there. And strongly rooted in, and as I mentioned, the real binding factor of most classical pantheists is the notion that God is the ground of all being, and that's a really strong notion that's found by most classical pantheists. Naturalistic pantheism holds that God's impersonal, nature itself, or the physical universe, and of course again that kind of brings into the question of the legitimacy of calling that entity God. But an important part of pantheism is that all things are part of or aspects of God. Usually that's the view of pantheists right there. Or they might take the route of the absolute idealists that take a more monistic slant and simply deny that there are individual things, and say there's only one thing, God, the absolute being, or so on and so forth. The fourth view is panentheism, which is an attempt to reconcile monotheism and pantheism, and I'm told it's pretty popular among various theologians and philosophers. And it says that God's immanent in nature, but ultimately transcendent of it. He's greater than nature, but he's not identical with it. And like pantheism, or at least like most versions of pantheism, barring monistic versions, all things are aspects or part of God in some sense. That is, God is ultimately, in some sense, within all things. This may or may not be taken literally for panentheists. However, this is, however, taken literally, that God is literally greater than nature or any particular thing, and ultimately transcendent. And it's kind of attractive to theologians and philosophers because it kind of combines an Anselmian theism, a radical Anselmian theism, combining the notion of God's necessity and that God is the ground of all being, and yet that God is still a distinct, concrete, personal entity. And still has many of the properties of classical theism. So some philosophers try to reconcile monotheism and pantheism and settle for panentheism. And these are the four views that consist the most common monotheistic viewpoints, going from most common to least common. First classical theism, followed by deism, followed by pantheism, followed by panentheism. Historic commonality, that is. And there are some less common versions, pandeism I've heard of, but they're not really relevant to the present discussion. Now, I want to discuss the definition of atheism. And I would say that atheism is the antithesis of theism, and there are two types of atheism, strong and weak atheism. And weak atheism is basically to not believe in God, and usually because most weak atheists say that the theism lacks epistemic support, and so you're in your epistemic rights to not believe in theism. And the strong formulation is to believe that theism is simply false. God doesn't exist. And this sounds really similar. I mean, not believing in God's existence versus believing in God's non-existence. But there's a crucial epistemic difference, and I'm going to try to give an example. Let's say that I tell you I have $1 million in my pocket in cash. Okay, that is $1 million in cash in my pocket. Okay, and I have a regular-sized pocket. No tricks, no strings, nothing like that. A regular-sized pocket. There's $1 million in cash in my pocket. Now, let's say further I give you no evidence at all. Now, I think most people and most philosophers, barring those that tend towards the insane, towards the insanity, those that tend towards the insane, would believe that you are pretty much rational in not believing my claim. However, when you say that you don't believe my claim, you're not necessarily saying that you believe that my claim is false. Okay? Because then you'd have to purportedly prove a negative. Okay? And so you're simply saying that the proposition I have $1 million in my pocket lacks epistemic support, sufficient epistemic support, and so you're rational in rejecting it as in not believing it to be true, and so you don't have to believe that proposition. And so this difference between strong and weak atheism involves critically the notion of justification with respect to beliefs. That said, however, some atheists, and I'm somewhat inclined to believe with them, is that not even strong atheism, even if there were, for instance, no good arguments against the existence of God, that strong atheists themselves don't have to provide any sort of argumentation to hold the belief that, they don't have to provide arguments that God doesn't exist in order to reject God's existence. And I will elaborate on that point later, especially with respect to discussing theism as an explanatory hypothesis and explain why that position is in fact viable, at least as I see it, is viable. The third definition